attacked, an insurrection took place. When the Congress was attempting to do its function to literally count the votes of the states and declare the winner, we were attacked and an insurrection took place in the U.S. Capitol. It caused us to delay our work, but we returned to our post and we got the work done. There was no question, having been on the floor of the United States Senate, that there was personal fear for our safety, but there was great fear for the safety of our democracy. We were committed to go back to work and get our work done, and we did, but the consequences of the January 6th attack are clearly going to be felt for a long time to come. One of the consequences, of course, was that the House of Representatives has taken up and passed impeachment article against the President of the United States, and that trial will begin shortly in the United States Senate. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I have two experts on this subject who can help us sort out what happened on January 6th, what led up to this, where do we go from here, what should be the consequences, how do we protect our democracy? So let me thank my two guests today, Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the CEO and National Director of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and one of the leading authorities in this country on the causes of hate in our community. And Marc Morial, who is the former mayor of the great city of New Orleans and the CEO of the National Urban League, and one of the most outspoken individuals in this country on equality and what we need to do to promote equality in America. So let me start by just getting your take on how did January the 6th ever happen in the United States and America? How did we see the sacred halls of the Congress overtaken by mobs, causing loss of life, damage to the physical capital, and damage to our democracy and global reputation? How did this come about, and should it have been prevented? And let me start, if I could, with Jonathan Greenblatt. And again, thank you. You might want to just let the audience a little bit about the ADL, the work that you're doing, and talk a little bit about how you think we got to where we did.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Senator Cardin. And it's a pleasure to be here with my friend, Marc Morial, and to be talking to your audience. So the ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the world. We're one of the longest standing civil rights organizations in the United States. Since 1913, we've been focused on fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. And in that line of work, we've been very focused for generations, really, on the issue of extremism. Now, extremism isn't new in this country. We had Nazi sympathizers before agitating to keep America out of the Second World War. We had a KKK that was brutal to African Americans. I mean, extremism isn't new, but we have seen a trend of late that's incredibly disturbing. So whereas anti-Semitic incidences were on the decline for 15 years, in 2016, they spiked up. And if you try to understand what caused that increase, it was correlated to the candidacy of Donald Trump, where for the first time they had an individual, prominent individual in public life who was literally repeating their rhetoric, who was sort of mainstreaming their memes, and who allowed them to move from the fringe into the forefront of the public conversation. This happened again and again when he gave sort of winks and nods, saying he didn't know who David Duke was to Jake Tapper on CNN, or suggesting that an anti-Semitic image about Hillary Clinton was tweeted out, unknowingly. And there were many other examples. And so I think really this came to prominence for many Americans in Charlottesville. And Charlottesville, Virginia was a dark, dark day when you had white supremacists, who came out and were marching out in the open, unapologetically, 150, 200 or so, yelling, "Jews will not replace us," right? It was a horrible day for our country. But unfortunately, I think this presidency will be remembered in the annals of history of the bookends of Charlottesville to Capitol Hill. And at Capitol Hill, you again had hundreds of hardcore militants. And I call them militants, Senator Cardin, because that's who they were. The people who led the charge on our Capitol, the people who organized that event, who who had maps and knew where they were going, and it was very planned. I mean, there was nothing spontaneous about it. This wasn't sort of a riot. This was an attack of domestic terror against our democracy. But to try to understand it, we have to then think about, well, why did it happen? And I'll give you what I would say are three causes. Number one, we had a presidency who's been like an antenna amplifying the signal of white supremacy for 4 years. And again, what started on the campaign continued in the Oval Office, repeating their rhetoric, literally integrating their ideas into policy and embracing them, whether it was credentialing white supremacist media, which inexplicably happened, or literally telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, or, again, moving out their memes across the presidential Twitter feed. It was really horrible. So when a president can't seem to call neo-Nazis anything other than very fine people, we've got a national crisis. So number one, he has essentially created the conditions. Secondly, social media. Social media literally aided and abetted this attack on our democracy by being way too lax for way too long on the worst elements of our society. We can talk more about that if you like. And then third and finally, look, there is a real issue in America where people feel, a kind of grievance, right? And so I think tens of thousands of people came to the mall for that rally, and they weren't all white supremacists. And against the backdrop of COVID, which has devastated our economy, it has devastated communities, people feel enraged. And the president stoking that rage and delegitimizing that election, the election which is really the firmament that holds together our liberal democracy, that created the conditions. It was like taking kindling and throwing a match. And I think we're going to live with the consequences for a long time, Senator Cardin, because while thankfully more lives weren't lost, Wednesday was a watershed moment for the white supremacist movement. They are now feeling energized. They are now feeling emboldened. And, I'm deeply worried about the threat of domestic terror, and not just the week ahead, in the months and years ahead.
You're muted.
I was listening.
We couldn't hear you.
Well, Senator
I think
Cardin.
I just got. I'm sorry about that. Mark, why don't you follow up here for a moment?
And I want to thank Jonathan Greenblatt for his passion and for logically and, if you will, chronologically laying out exactly what we've seen. I'd like to offer this thought, and that is people of goodwill have to stand up to what we have seen. Because what we have seen is not mere politics and not mere protest. Mm-hmm. It was criminal racketeering. Mm-hmm. It was rank illegality. It was an effort to foist a coup on the United States of America in our history of almost 250 years. Other than the Civil War, we've not seen an effort to violently overthrow the government. These mobsters, rioters, and protesters had in their mind the disruption of the actions of the Congress in certifying the votes of a free and fair election at which almost 200 million Americans voted. And in their demented, sick, twisted, and tortured psyche, they were going to overturn or disrupt the Congress so that the instigator and the inciter of this violent coup, Donald Trump, could somehow remain in office past the 20th of January. We have not heard the full story as of yet. The investigations being undertaken by law enforcement are going to shed more light. The intent of many of the mobsters and insurrectionists was to go into the Capitol and not only destroy property, but to take leaders hostage, to assassinate people, to engage in a violent overthrow of the government of the United States. It is hard and it is painful for me to admit that in this year, 2021, it has come to this. We have got to eliminate the political ideology of white supremacy, which is about racism, anti-Semitism. It is about hatred, and it is about the utilization of violence to achieve its ends. So I think that we are at a moment where men and women of goodwill, men and women of all backgrounds, races, creeds, colors, religions, and political parties have to stand up and say, we want those who incited, those who encouraged, those who carried it out, held fully accountable. This is no time to play. This is no time to say, oh, shucks. We are not dividing the nation by standing on principle, Senator Cardin. We are uniting the nation around values. The values that this country is based on, that we've all been working to improve this nation against a difficult set of circumstances. So I want to just close this segment, this part of my comment, by just thanking Jonathan and ADL for what they do, because their research in tracking hate crimes is something every member of Congress should see. The documentation of the increase in the number of hate crimes that have taken place in the age of Trump. Donald Trump is a clear and present danger to American democracy. He is a clear and present danger to the values we hold dear. He must be impeached. He must be removed. He must be prosecuted and convicted and pay the cost for his actions. No man is above the law.
Well, to Marc Morial and Jonathan Greenblatt, thank you for those comments. Let me assure you that our two priorities is first to make sure our country is safe. We have the inauguration is going to take place on January the 20th. It will take place and it will be safe. And Joe Biden will become the 46th president of the United States on January the 20th at 12 noon, the duly elected president of the United States. But our other priority is to hold accountable every person responsible for what happened on January the 6th, whether it be the president of the United States or the individuals who entered the Capitol or those who helped plan this attack on our country. So that's going to be clearly our priorities, and we're not going to stop. I had conversations today with the Maryland FBI. They're part of the team. It's all hands on deck in order to make sure that we keep safe and we hold accountable those responsible. But I want to get back to the point that both of you have pointed out, and that is the amount of hate that we are seeing legitimated in our community. And there seems to be a very positive correlation between the rise of nationalism, the rise of hate crimes, the rise of anti-migrant sentiment, along with anti-Semitic conduct to racial hatred. They all seem to be very much interrelated. I have the opportunity to be the special representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Parliamentary Assembly for Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Intolerance. And we have been watching the rise of nationalism throughout the world, particularly in some democratic states, a rise of nationalism. And with that has been a sharp rise in hate crimes and violence. So we really are all in this together. If we try to stovepipe our concerns about racism and not concerned about what's happening against migrants or what's happening against Jews or Muslims, we do that at our own peril because it's all very much related. And Jonathan, I know your organization has done a lot of study on this. Where do you start? How do you start bringing this under control?
Well, it's interesting, Senator Cardin, when ADL was founded in 1913 after the lynching of a Jewish man outside of Atlanta, the founders of ADL, they wrote a charter for this organization. It looks a bit like a manifesto, like in our modern kind of vernacular. And in it, they wrote that the purpose of the organization, and it's still our mission today, would be to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. So since ADL was started, there has always been this sense that America would only be safe for its Jews when it's safe for all minorities. And only when it's safe for all people would it be safe for the Jewish community. And I think that has literally, that imperative has coursed through our organization and animated it for more than a century. And that's important because many people have described, anti-Semitism as the oldest hatred. But in reality, I would call it the canary in the coal mine. So those people who hate Jews, and make no mistake, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred is like the beating heart of white supremacy. They hate blacks, they hate Muslims, they hate immigrants, they hate the LGBTQ community, they hate Latinos, they hate anyone who is different, particularly people of color. And it is pernicious and it is profound and it is a persistent feature of this kind of intolerance. So how do we win? First and foremost, as you've laid out, I think very articulately, Senator Cardin, we need to recognize that all these forms of intolerance are interrelated. And you can't struggle against anti-Semitism unless you also struggle against anti-Black racism. I would say anti-Black racism is not just Mark's problem as a Black man, it's my problem as a Jewish man. And I would say to all of us that anti-Asian hate isn't just the problem of, say, Congresswoman Chu or Congresswoman Meng or Congresswoman Liu. It's our problem as Jews and African Americans. So we need to appreciate that the fight against hate is not something we can, to use your term, stovepipe. We've got to see the bigger picture and try to create an America that is more inclusive, that is more diverse, and that truly takes this notion of equality seriously for everyone, regardless of how they look or where they pray or who they love.
Mark, how do you bring the groups together when you have the turf issues and, in some cases, different perceived priorities? How do you show unity against hate?
Well, one of the first things, Senator, is that leaders cannot be intimidated by hate. And regrettably, we see leaders intimidated by hate because of, quote, potential political backlash. But we have to stand up to hate in word and in deed. And this is perhaps the most troubling element of what we see today, that this hate movement, and this is the legacy of Donald Trump, has become normalized as a political movement and as a component of the Republican Party. Historically, this hate movement has existed. White supremacy has existed. It's been in the shadows. It's been on the fringe. It's been active in many circles, but it's never been normalized by dog whistles and foghorns as it has by Donald Trump. His irresponsibility in seeking adoration and aggrandizement of who he is has created a climate in the nation where many of your colleagues on the GOP side of the aisle are, if you will, stunned into silence. And Jonathan, we know from history that it is the silence of good people. It is when good people don't speak up and stand up that hate and racism and anti-Semitism flourish. So that's a starting point. Voices have to speak with conviction and principle against hate. And in our actions and our deeds, we always have to build bridges around principles. So we will see, as the Senate considers the possible conviction of Donald Trump and the evidence comes out, where the courage is, where the morality is, where the sense of right and wrong is, and who will be intimidated, and who will be in silence while their conscience is saying something else to them.
Mark, I just want to underscore.
Can I build on what Mark
Sure.
said? I think it's so important. If we want to beat hate and we want to have unity, it's got to start with accountability.
Yeah.
And as Mark so articulately said, no one is above the law. So I think it is critical to underscore that the impeachment that just happened was bipartisan, the most bipartisan impeachment in the history of the United States of America. And whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, if you incite against our democracy, right? If you encourage violence against elected officials, if you try to undermine, again, the electoral process, which is the foundation of this entire experiment, then like that's a criminal offense. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what your station. Although I would say that the consequences are even greater when you've got the biggest bully pulpit in the world. So if we want to fight hate, and I think we all do, it's got to start with accountability. Whether you were a militant marauding through the halls of our Capitol, or whether you were an elected official giving them guidance about where to go and aiding and abetting the crime, or whether you had the highest office in the land and you encouraged them while they were assaulting police officers to keep going. Like, I mean, it's almost inexplicable, Ben. And we've got to get to the bottom of it. And again, make sure that the law and justice is applied to everyone in this case.
I want to get into the discussion about the impeachment trial in a few minutes, but I know we only have Mark for a few more minutes, and I want to take advantage of that if I might. You know Joe Biden well. You know Kamala Harris well. They're going to take the oath of office in just a few days. Recognizing what happened on January the 6th, what are the first steps that the Biden-Harris administration should take in order to make it clear that we will not tolerate hate in our community and there will be accountability from what happened on January 6th? What advice would you give our new administration as to steps that they could take quickly to try to restore the values of this nation and make it clear there will be no room given for racism or hatred?
You know, Senator, the nation is looking forward with great anticipation to this transition in power. Donald Trump's approval ratings are now at 29%. He's lost and continues to lose support from his base because of his irresponsible actions. President Biden and Vice President Harris on January 20th have to send a message of principled unity.
Mm-hmm.
Principled unity. Unity around tolerance, unity around a battle against hatred, unity around a battle against disparities. And principled unity means bringing the nation together, people of goodwill, united in purpose. So the words that they choose, the way in which they communicate on the 20th is crucial. But then they're the action. They're the policies. I think the Department of Justice and the entire apparatus of law enforcement must be energized and greenlit to follow the evidence, to uncover the cells of domestic terrorism and hate, and to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. And I think that that includes all federal, state, and local law enforcement. We've got to root this out because it's one thing when people peacefully protest and you don't like what they say. It's another thing when they resort to violence. In this instance, they resorted to mass violence with guns and explosives and threatened the lives of public servants, from the vice president to members of the Senate, the Congress, staffers, and Capitol Police. So they're the words that the new president uses. They're the words that the new vice president uses. And then they're the actions that their administration takes. And so we want no hesitancy, no trepidation, no excuses in a full-fledged attack on white supremacy and domestic terrorism here in the United States. And I know Jonathan and I will both encourage it and support it and hold them accountable to do it. This, Senator and Jonathan, is about our children and children's children. We're gonna stand up at this moment of a threat to everything that generations of men and women have worked their lives for. To have it torn asunder by haters, dividers, intolerant, racist, anti-Semite, hooligans, mobsters, and rioters. I say no, no, no.
Well, to Marc Morial, let me thank you very much for joining us. I know you're going to have to leave the program.
Thanks,
but thank you for all you do for our
I
country
appreciate your service
and your leadership. And we know that there is going to be an opportunity for us to work together to restore confidence in this country. This is a great nation, and we're going to figure a way back on track. But we certainly have work to do. So thank you.
We look forward to working with you, Senator. Thank you to you and your team, and Jonathan always. And we'll be talking soon. Thank you.
Great. And fortunately, we still have Jonathan Greenblatt with us, who is the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. So, Jonathan, I want to talk a little bit about first accountability. So let's go back just for a moment. On accountability, the House passed an article of impeachment based upon inciting an insurrection. Under the Constitution that's now will be transmitted to the Senate. It's my understanding that Leader McConnell, who is still the leader until after January the 20th, has decided he will not bring the Senate back early to consider that. So the resolution of impeachment, articles of impeachment, will first be considered on January the 19th at the earliest, and a trial could not begin until after January the 20th, when Donald Trump will no longer be president of the United States. So the first question is, there needs to be accountability for all who are responsible. We've learned over the history of our nation that accountability for the president of the United States is not an easy process under our Constitution. There are disagreements as to whether a sitting president can be charged with criminal offense. The Justice Department has taken the position that a sitting president cannot be charged while sitting in office. There's a question about punitive action against a president of the United States. Is the constitutional provisions in regards to impeachment the exclusive remedy, or are there other remedies available? But now we're crossing a path that is very seldom used. Impeachment proceedings that have begun while a person is in office, the person is no longer in office, not because of resignation, but because the term has ended. Any advice you want to give us as to how we should be proceeding to deal with the accountability of the president, who, even those who voted against impeachment in the House, many were extremely critical of the president's role in encouraging an insurrection against our country?
Well, look, I'm neither a political scientist nor a constitutional scholar, so I don't know that I'm the best person to talk about kind of the procedural engineering of the Senate trial. But if I step back from that, Senator Cardin, I would say a few things. Number one, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a registered independent, there is nothing partisan about calling out those who would perpetrate violence against our democracy. And those militants and the mob behind them who are assaulting police officers, who are threatening legislators, frankly, including yourself. They were chanting at times, "Hang Mike Pence." And to be very clear, I don't think they were differentiating all that precisely, as they were rampaging, through the building about, well, is that desk that of a Democrat or Republican? So, and I say this because these are anarchists, if you will, more than anything else, who want to topple the government. Maybe you could say they're not really even Republicans, they're Trumpists. And they should have no place in the public conversation. There should be a zero tolerance policy on the intolerance that they promoted. So I feel very strongly that each of these individuals needs to be arrested and prosecuted, and the politicians or elected officials who helped them at all levels. Now, I say this because if we want to move past this kind of MAGA militancy and differentiate between the tens of millions of people who voted for President Trump who aren't necessarily, white supremacists, plenty of them, the vast majority, I believe, I think we do need to hold the MAGA militants accountable to demonstrate that there is no place for them in a normal political process, let alone, I hope, a 21st century Republican Party. Now, look, I know people like Mitt Romney, people like, Ben Sass, people like Lynn Cheney, who are in elected office, in the chambers are saying this, as well as on the outside, people like Paul Ryan, people like Dick Cheney, people like George W. Bush. I mean, again, I think the vast majority of the political establishment in their GOP want nothing to do with this sort of militant MAGA movement. But if we don't hold the people accountable, I'm afraid, Senator Cardin, it will persist, and it could poison the entire our entire body politic. So I think the stakes are very high, and it's going to be up. I mean, to be very honest, Mr. Senator, it's going to be up to you and your colleagues to make sure that whatever trial you put on is done in an ethical and fair and open way, but that actually pursues justice to its appropriate, to its appropriate outcome.
Well, I can assure you that our fondest hope, and I think we have a real chance to achieve this, is that the process that's used in the United States Senate will be a nonpartisan or a bipartisan process, because I really do believe this is the most serious bipartisan effort to remove a president in history. So it's I think it will be elevated. We hope it will be, but we're going to have to overcome the challenge of the fact that the president is no longer in office, and we'll see how that issue is played. And there's so many cross currents. You're sort of, if you go one way, they're going to criticize you for taking on a president who's no longer there. You go the other way, they would say, you can't penalize them now. You should have done it before. So we're going to get in that crosswinds. But your point is very well taken. There's got to be accountability, and we need to figure out how to get that done to make it clear this type of conduct cannot go unpunished. I want to talk about an area that the ADL is very strong about, and that is you fight hate, but you don't fight free speech. You're very clear about the protections we have for people to be able to voice their concerns. And that presents a dilemma. But I want to bring this to modern times. We talked about the fact that this is the first administration that gave room for hate in modern times, gave legitimacy to white supremacists. But it's also during a time where social media has played a more and more important role in informing the public. And social media is not necessarily responsible. So how do we deal with the challenges of social media today, that anyone basically can become their own megaphone of hate? How do we deal with that? How are there practices that we can incorporate to deal with these new challenges?
So there are a few things, right? So number one, we should just keep in mind that, the kind of calls to violence we've seen are not protected speech, right? Freedom of speech isn't the freedom to slander. Freedom of expression is the freedom to incite violence. These things are outside the pale wherever they happen. So let's just acknowledge that, number one. You can't yell cry or foul. You can't cry fire in a crowded theater if it's not correct. And you can't say you want to go out and hurt someone or commit an act of violence. Again, there's plenty of precedent that says that that's not permissible. It's not protected by the First Amendment. Let's also acknowledge, number two, that at least based on the Roberts Court, businesses are not bound by the First Amendment. Government is. So In the same way, I used to be an executive at Starbucks. If you walk into a Starbucks and you stand at the counter and scream at the patrons to go back to Mexico, what do you think the Starbucks manager will do? Right? He'll throw you out. Or I know Marriott is a big employer in Maryland. If you go stand in the lobby of a Marriott and you yell at the staff, that there's a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the world, what do you think the hotel manager will do? Or if you're a white supremacist, you try to book your conference in the ballroom, what do you think they'll say? They'll throw you out. We don't want that in our business. And so I would like to think that Facebook and Twitter would behave by the same standards as Starbucks and Microsoft and say that our business is no place for bigots. And we're not going to, they have the right to say awful things, but they don't have the right to do it on our platform. It's a violation of our terms of service, and it's a violation of our own kind of code of conduct. But the companies have been way too lackadaisical about that to date. So to answer your question, we need to just acknowledge it's not protected speech when you want to perpetrate violence against an individual or a community, and it doesn't even apply in these businesses. But we are going to need, number one, the business community to step up. Last summer, the ADL, along with the NAACP, Color of Change, LULAC, and other groups organized something called the Stop Hate for Profit campaign that pushed Facebook to finally deal with the rampant hate, Holocaust denialism, racism, and white supremacy on their platform. And the way that it worked is we said to Facebook, you need to do this, but when they wouldn't comply, we organized more than 1,000 businesses to pull their ads from Facebook, some for the month of July, some for the duration of the year. And that's when Facebook actually complied with our request and made a series of concessions. So business has the power to make choices about the voices that they privilege and lift up. And those businesses who might not be directly in the media space, have the power to use their purse strings, in this case, their advertising dollars, to pull back and support and not support a business model, which again is, promoting prejudice. So I think the business community has a lot to do with it. But then I would just say civil society is also critical. If we really want to deal with these hate issues, you're going to need NGOs, not just like the ADL. You're going to need programs like, say, AmeriCorps that get young people engaged in service. So people across class lines, across racial divides, and, dare I say, Senator, across the ideological spectrum, get to know one another and work hand in hand. Look, you see this. You don't just need kind of secular service organizations like City Year, although they're wonderful. We could learn a lot from the Church of Latter-day Saints. We could learn a lot from the Jesuits. We could learn a lot from groups like Repair the World, a Jewish service organization, or Avodah. So I think in civil society, faith-based organizations and communities of worship, along with secular organizations, have a role to play in bringing people together.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Private companies have a responsibility. And since January the 6th, we've seen many of our business companies step up to the plate with pretty significant action taken against those who were responsible or contributed to the events of January the 6th. And we need our social media platforms to do the same. So, yeah, I agree with you completely that there is a responsibility from the business community to not be complicitous in the promotion of hate. I've attended many international conferences dealing with discrimination, trying to prevent anti-Semitism, racism, and we share information. And one of the more interesting discussions we've had is government restrictions on social media platforms and where is the appropriate role for government. Mm-hmm. And whenever we get into those discussions, the United States is always looked upon and say, well, you can't do what we can do because you have the First Amendment. I respond by saying, I don't believe that's correct. I think we can do action against those who are promoting hate and violence. But I think we've been timid about going down that path. And I expect that the events of January the 6th will move us to evaluate how we can set up the proper government regulatory structure so that we are not used to bring down our democratic institutions as we were on January the 6th. I don't know if the ADL has a view on that or whether you personally have a view on that, but it's an area that we need as much participation as possible to try to figure out what is the proper balance for government intervention.
Well, I'll tell you something, we have felt for a long time that Facebook was the front line in fighting hate. So the ADL opened a center in Silicon Valley in 2017, and we work directly with the companies and connect with them. And sometimes we will actually call them out when they think they overstep. And for a long time, as a former entrepreneur, I believe that, self-regulation was the way to go, Senator Cardin, that the companies are innovating at such an accelerated rate that we can't keep up with the technology on the outside. We need them to work with us, and we certainly do. But I've also come to the conclusion that self-regulation is an insufficient condition to achieve the outcome that we want. And in fact, we need some degree of government intervention. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Facebook for 15 years had never dealt with these issues before was they weren't just kind of, governed by a libertarian ethos that said anything goes. And it wasn't just because of the personal views of some of the executives. And it wasn't just because the technology wasn't keeping up. It's because they didn't feel the pressure to deal with it. And, I heard Shoshana Zuboff of Harvard Business School describe it as monopolistic indifference. And so I think when we think about what's the role of government to deal with these issues, particularly as it relates to tech and social media, which again have corroded the conversation in some really dramatic ways, I think we need to think about, okay, what would intervention look like? Number one, I think it merits having a real robust conversation about competition policy and whether or not some of these companies are too big and have created the conditions in which they're impervious to public opinion because they're not worried about losing revenue or fiduciary pressure because their market lock is so tight. I think we need to look at the issue of privacy because, again, as Professor Zuboff says, when the product is free, you're the product. And the control they have of the data is also deeply alarming because, again, it gives them the ability to do things like algorithmically amplify extremists, right? And unknowingly to you, stream content into your newsfeed that literally shapes your worldview in ways that can be, at best, very unhelpful. So I think there's an antitrust question. I think there's a privacy question. And ultimately, I think there's this question about like Section 230 and what expression is normalized in these networks. Look, if we didn't have Section 230 and the user-generated content that it allows, Senator Cardin, we wouldn't have Wikipedia, we wouldn't have Yelp, we wouldn't have the web as we know it. So I'm not someone who believes you repeal it outright, but I do believe it needs reform because I know what it's about in theory, but the reality is that it's created an environment like the one we have today where extremism flourishes. And if the companies don't have the capabilities of tackling that hateful content on their own, then I would just say, and Senator Cardin, this is where you come in, in any other industry, if your product isn't working, you pull it off the shelf. I mean, go back to the 1980s when there were a couple bottles of Tylenol that were tampered with. Do you remember in the Chicagoland area? What did J&J do? They pulled every Tylenol bottle off every shelf in America, and they redesigned the packaging, and then they reintroduced it when it was safe and secure. And then in the 90s, there's a juice company called Odwalla. They have the bottled juices. A couple people, I think, died from E. coli from drinking their juices out into the California. And so what do? Odwalla pulled every bottle of Odwalla off the shelf in America. And then they reformulated it. And then they only put it back on the market when they knew it was safe and secure. So if, say, Facebook is literally poisoning the public, filling individuals with intolerance, facilitating criminal acts like the act of terror we saw last week, what should you do? Well, I think social media should abide by the same standards as consumer products or over-the-counter pharma, and they should pull the product off the shelf and they should fix it and then relaunch it once it works. And what's the threshold for working? Keeping its users safe and secure. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Now, I expect this is going to be a subject of great discussion and I think action in this Congress. This is an area that is long overdue, and the recent events really put this into the spotlight. I want to just talk a moment about one of the challenges that the Biden administration will confront from day one,
Mm-hmm.
and that is systemic racism in America and systemic discrimination. We saw that play out in policing in this country, and the episodes of the very diverse population of our country coming out to protest against police injustice, Black Lives Matter. And we saw the response from the Trump administration in regards to how those protesters were restricted and their peaceful demonstration disrupted by the security that was imposed upon them, and in some cases strictly for political theater. And then we see the protests, supposed protests in regards to the election results on January the 6th, without anywhere near the type of presence and in some cases no resistance to the violence that took place.
Yeah.
One cannot notice the difference between how these events were treated and recognizing there is a direct relationship between systemic racism in America.
Mm-hmm.
How do we connect the dots in this regard? And are we correct? What was the reason why there was such a lack of resistance or capacity to resist the crowds on January the 6th?
Well, so I think, Senator Cardin, there's two things at work here. So first, let's talk about what happened this past summer. I mean, the murder of George Floyd on the heels of the unnecessary killing of so many boys and young men of color, armed citizens who, rather than getting the benefit of the doubt, got the barrel of the gun. I mean, there's a long list of again, boys and men who have lost their lives in ways that are, really criminal. So I think the murder of George Floyd in broad daylight, under his neck, under the knee of a police officer, taken an oath to sworn an oath to keep people safe. I think that was literally the straw that broke the camel's back, and people were enraged with good reason. And you had the death of Breonna Taylor that happened right around the same time. It was just too much. And so I think the protests that ensued and the demand of ordinary people for racial justice and the cries that Black Lives Matter, like, no one should have been surprised. I think there was so much pent up anger. And it happened, by the way, not just, African Americans demanding racial justice, people across communities. You had white people, you had Latinos, you had Asians, you had Jews and Christians and Muslims, and just a broad diversity, a tapestry of what makes our country so great. I don't think we have yet seen a true accounting for the ills of systemic racism and structural discrimination that continue to plague our communities. And I think it's going to require time to not only investigate those issues, but to identify the causes and create the change we need. I have, been engaged with, I think, as have you, the Biden transition team. I know this is an issue of urgency for them, for the president, for the vice president. I am optimistic that we'll be able to make the kind of progress on these issues we haven't seen in years. And as a civil rights organization, I got to tell you, we are aching to work with them to move the ball downfield to ensure that our country lives up to its, ideals. So I am hopeful there. I am hopeful. But the contrast in the way that the protests were handled last summer and the way the mob was managed last week is almost inexplicable. I literally don't understand why the Capitol Hill police didn't get more support. I don't understand why the National Guard hadn't been deployed, when the mob was assembling on the national mall. I mean, let's be clear. We all knew what this rally was about. We'd been hearing about the Stop the Steal event, for months. And at ADL, we track extremists. We had been giving intelligence to law enforcement because we knew that the gathering would be a who's who of right-wing extremists. And we knew that their narrative was one of disenfranchisement, right? That they had been denied their president. And that despite all the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that the election was somehow illegitimate. And that the president was inciting them. I mean, literally, he said it from the podium, fight, fight, fight. And Rudy Giuliani said, trial by combat. And, that's the least of it. I mean, there were even more explicit things said by others. So, again, it wasn't like we didn't know it was going to happen. I would describe that event, Senator Cardin, as the most predictable terror attack in American history. They should have been prepared. The perimeter should have been established. The Capitol should have been safeguarded. Now, I will say, despite the inscrutable decisions of the political leadership, whether it was at the DHS or the White House, I don't really know, that so many Capitol Hill police fought so bravely. And I think you saw this in the videos that were being streamed real time, and you heard it now, and you've seen it in the photos, and you've heard it in some of the first person accounts of these police officers themselves. I mean, again, there are some questions about some members of the force, sure, but the vast majority fought bravely, and they were under-equipped, they were outmanned, and they were overpowered by this mob that was led by militants. But the bravery they showed, the courage they displayed, when the president himself was inciting the violence, I think all of us should be humbled by their heroism and really thank them for their service.
Well, I agree completely, and I have done that, and my colleagues in the Senate have done it also. And clearly, we want an investigation as to why the Capitol Police were not prepared, didn't have the manpower they needed. But the bravery of those that stood their ground and sustained injuries, in one case, sustained death. It saved us. I know that we're going to honor one of the Capitol Police that literally, through his ingenuity, prevented the mob from entering the Senate chamber while we were still in the Senate chamber. So right. It was that type of bravery where they really protected our lives and protected our institution that we really want to show our appreciation. But one can easily draw a comparison here that in the demonstrations that took place there through the George Floyd murder, that it was the administration that wanted to show force and to prevent this demonstration from having its intended effect to peacefully demonstrate a need for change. And they were prepared to make that not the story. And they handled the crowd in a way so that the president could get his message across. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Capitol, there was at least an impression that the administration wanted this crowd to be able to get to the Capitol and to make their point without interference. And therefore, the preparation was intentional not to be done because of the political circumstances. These are at least issues that need to be understood because the inequities here are clearly visible and need to be understood. We want to make sure we never repeat this again. So we're going to get to the bottom of it. There's going to be a full investigation. We're going to find out. We had problems getting our National Guard because we couldn't get approval from the Secretary of Defense, and that delayed things for a little bit of time. There is no such problems in regards to the summer demonstrations. So the comparisons here are certainly troublesome and ones that we're going to have to look at as we move forward. I just really, Jonathan, want to thank you not just for being on our show, but what you do. I use ADL's numbers all the time. I really thank you. You provide us great service, and we use your information in regards to legislation that we're considering in the Congress, as well as, I'm sure you're aware of this, but on the international front, the ADL numbers are the basis for us getting global response to deal with the rise of discrimination and hate, etc. So you play a very, very important role as we move forward. To me, the strength of America is in our values, who we are as a nation, what we believe in, the value that each person should be able to achieve his or her potential, and that we need to rid any discrimination in our society based upon race or religion or an ethnic background or sexual orientation. All those issues all are so much related. And ADL plays such an important role in all those efforts. So let me once again thank Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. And thank you all for joining us today on Facebook Live. And we'll be back soon because there's a lot more issues to talk about. Stay safe, everybody, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.